Hey everyone, tonight we're getting into something a little bit toothier, but certainly not in a pleasant way. We're plunging into the grim, unsettling world of medieval dentistry, a time when dental procedures involved iron pliers, everyone's breath was famously bad, and your strongest painkiller was typically just a hearty prayer and a mug of ale. So, before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I create here. And please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our global audience. Now, dim the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that soft, ambient hum, and let's gently drift into tonight's historical journey. If you've ever dreaded a trip to the dentist, count yourself incredibly fortunate. Because back in medieval Europe, your dental practitioner was likely the local blacksmith, and a routine checkup came with a side of intense screaming. Your journey as a medieval dental assistant wouldn't begin with a calling, but rather with a pervasive odor. You'd be born into a cramped hovel, with a dirt floor, a thatched roof, and a family where bad breath was simply an accepted part of life. Nobody brushed their teeth, toothbrushes were unknown, and soap? That was a luxury reserved for sophisticated nobles or monks dealing with skin ailments. As a baby, your gums would ache from gnawing on hard bread crusts and dried roots, as that was all available. Teething wouldn't be alleviated by chilled rings. Instead, you'd be soothed with beer-soaked rags and whispered prayers. Crying was thought to mean you were growing stronger. In reality, your gums were inflamed, and your first baby tooth would likely rot before it had the chance to fall out naturally. By the age of 5, you'd already witnessed an adult spit out a molar during dinner and simply continue eating. Your grandmother would store her extracted teeth in a small pouch for good luck, and your father's smile would resemble a decaying graveyard. Nobody would be concerned. This was the norm. And then there was the smell of people's breath. Oh, the breath. Every adult's breath would smell like a cave full of old cheese and deep regrets. Your friends wouldn't notice as they smelled the same. You, however, possessed an unfortunate sensitivity to odors. But this sensitive nose would be the first hint that you might be destined for the world of dentistry. At 7 years old, you'd watch the village blacksmith remove a tooth from a villager using tongs typically reserved for horseshoes. The man would scream, bleed profusely, and then thank him afterward. You, being overly inquisitive, would ask too many questions. So they'd hand you a rag, tell you to clean up the blood, and just like that, you'd become the assistant. There would be no elaborate ceremony, no formal oath, no official title, but on that day, your future would be sealed. You'd be the child unafraid of open mouths, the boy who didn't faint at the sight of blood, the one who instinctively knew how to boil pliers and suppress nausea. Congratulations! You'd now be the unofficial apprentice to the village's least glamorous profession. Your playthings would be forceps, your lessons would involve enduring pain, and your companions would be extracted molars clinking into bowls. You wouldn't dream of becoming a knight, a bard, or even a scribe. You'd dream of not flinching the next time someone screamed directly into your face. And so, your journey would begin, not with a pristine white coat, but with a blood-stained apron and a rather unfortunate destiny. Let's be honest. Dental hygiene in the Middle Ages was practically a myth, and if it ever existed, it likely vanished with a scream around the 6th century. You, the future village tooth puller, would grow up in a world where people cleaned their teeth with, well, nothing. If they were particularly well off and we're talking monastery-level fancy, they might chew on twigs or rinse with wine, but for most people, they simply let nature run its course, and nature was rarely kind to molars. There was no toothpaste, no floss, and no understanding that sugar might harm tooth enamel, primarily because the word enamel was unheard of. The only consistent sweetness peasants experienced was misery, though nobles occasionally indulged in honey-glazed concoctions that accelerated mouth decay with a certain aristocratic flair. As you grew, with a keen eye for teeth, you'd begin to notice a consistent pattern. Everyone's breath smelled as if something had died in their mouth and brought along companions. Halitosis wasn't a condition. It was simply a fact of life. You'd learn to speak from a distance, instinctively breathing through your mouth, which, ironically, only worsened your own odor. Children lost teeth at a young age, not due to aging, but from accidents, infections, or chewing on small stones hidden in bread. By age 10, most people already had 2 or 3. Ghost teeth, gaps where a tooth once stood. People accepted this just as they accepted mud on their shoes or fleas in their bedding. Herbal remedies did exist, of course. You might chew mint or rinse with vinegar if you could afford it. But largely, tooth care involved hoping the pain would disappear before it spread to your jaw and became fatal. And no one ever discussed the gums. Gums were simply red, swollen tissue that bled when touched, and apparently that was perfectly acceptable. The very notion of gently brushing them with a soft bristled brush would have sounded like witchcraft. As a budding medieval dentist, you'd begin to catalog this widespread oral horror with morbid fascination. You'd poke teeth with sticks. You'd learn the distinction between a tooth that was wobbly but still alive, and one that was dead but stubbornly clinging on. And when someone asked what you wanted to be when you grew up, you'd respond, someone who makes the screaming stop. Because in your world, only 2 types of smiles existed, the toothless and the soon-to-be toothless. So, how did one become a medieval dentist? Quite simply, you didn't in any formal sense. There were no medical universities, no dental licenses, no board examinations. You learned by observing human suffering, and the most effective way to do that was by working under the most hands-on man in town, the barber-surgeon. He wasn't a doctor in the modern sense. He was a versatile craftsman with blood perpetually staining his sleeves. He trimmed beards, lanced boils, set broken bones, and even amputated gangrenous limbs, all perhaps between breakfast and lunch. Naturally, he also extracted teeth because why wouldn't he? And now you were his apprentice. You swept the floor. You restrained screaming patients. You fetched boiling water not for sterilization, but merely to create an impression of efficacy. During your first week, you'd witness a leg amputation performed with a dull saw, with only a leather strap as a form of anesthesia. You'd faint twice, but by week 2, you'd be holding a torch. By week 3, you'd be helping steady heads while your mentor yanked molars with blacksmith tongs. Your persistent questioning would lead to your promotion to cleanup duty. Blood, pus, and teeth. Your mentor was a pragmatic individual. If it's loose, pull it. He would instruct. If it's black, pull it. If they scream, pull it faster. He'd teach you that a quick extraction was superior to a clean one, that infection was God's will, not your responsibility, and that you'd be paid more if you pretended to pray first. There was no textbook, just instinct, superstition, and repetitive practice. You'd learn to discern which tooth would come out with a simple twist and which would snap in half, leaving you with a sobbing peasant and a pair of broken pliers. When complications arose, you'd learn the contingency plan. Blame demons, attribute it to their diet, or in dire emergencies, blame the stars. Astrology was remarkably popular in medieval medical theory, especially when an abscess couldn't be drained and your patient started foaming at the mouth. Sometimes you'd assist with battlefield injuries, sometimes with applying leeches. But your mentor always made sure you were present for tooth extraction days, because as he liked to say, nothing humbles a man like bleeding from the face. And slowly, through blood, through screams, through trial and terror, you'd learn. You weren't a healer yet, but you were becoming something far more essential in the medieval world. A person who could alleviate pain for a price. If you're envisioning a sterile tray of gleaming instruments, arranged with surgical precision, you're thinking far too modern. A medieval dentist's toolkit resembled something confiscated from a dungeon. And you'd be learning to skillfully use every single piece. First, the pliers. Thick, rusted, and heavy, designed not for teeth, but for horseshoes, meat hooks, and stubborn nails. The handles carried the scent of old sweat and iron. The grip was often unreliable, but if they could clamp onto something and pull, they were considered effective. Then came the tooth key, a twisted little crank intended to twist a tooth sideways until it became loose. It rarely succeeded on the first attempt. Typically, it would snap the tooth in half, followed by you frantically digging out the root while your patient wept into a burlap sleeve. You also possessed various hooks and scrapers. One resembled a shepherd's crook, perfect for snagging stubborn fragments. Another was like a sharpened spoon, used to scoop out abscesses and pack them with moldy bread or ashes. Sterile? Absolutely not. There was also the mallet, yes, a mallet for when the pliers failed, and a bit of persuasion. was needed, you'd hold the tool against the tooth and give it a firm tap. If your aim was true, the tooth would dislodge. If not, well, the jaw might shift a little. The instruments weren't labeled. Some had previously been used for animal care. Others might have been fishing tools in a former life. You'd inherit most of them from the Barber-Surgeon's recently deceased mentor. Tools he, in turn, inherited from his mentor, and so on. One particular tool bore a notch carved into its handle. It was either a maker's mark or someone's tally of fatalities. Cleaning was optional. Sometimes they were simply wiped with a cloth, occasionally passed through a flame, not to sterilize, but to add dramatic effect. Bloodstains were considered part of the seasoning. Your role was to keep the tools organized, reasonably clean, and ready at a moment's notice. When someone walked in clutching their jaw, the last thing they desired was delay. They wanted you to extract something quickly and without excessive questioning. These weren't instruments of healing. They were tools of desperate mercy. And in your hands, they would determine whether a person walked out smiling or never walked out at all. In the medieval world, genuine dental science was non-existent. However, theories? Oh, they had an abundance. Tooth pain wasn't believed to be caused by bacteria or decay. Nobody knew what plaque was, and enamel might as well have been a type of prayer. So what did people believe caused those throbbing, pus-filled, jaw-splitting toothaches? Worms. Tiny, malicious, invisible worms. Yes, tooth worms. These mythical creatures were said to burrow into your molars and chew away relentlessly, like termites in a wooden beam. If your tooth ached, it meant the worm was hungry. If it fractured, the worm had finished its meal. As a budding dentist, you'd be taught to maintain a serious expression while nodding sagely when someone inquired, "Is it the worm again, master?" And you'd confirm because it always was. Of course, there was also the religious interpretation. Some believed tooth pain was divine punishment for dishonesty, for vanity, or for indulging in too much honeyed bread. Your task, to extract the sinful tooth as if performing an exorcism with pliers. Patients would often ask you to pray before an extraction. You'd comply, mostly to calm them, and perhaps a little because you yourself were afraid. After all, you'd witnessed infections spread to the neck and prove fatal within days. Surely the gods had a hand in it, right? But the most widely held belief, and the one your mentor swore by, was that if you placed a roasted onion next to the aching tooth, the worm would crawl out. Of course, all you ever observed was steam and tears, never any worms. But the patient believed it. Placebo, magic, and onion breath, a medieval double remedy. You'd even learn a few worm-charming rituals. One involved whispering to the tooth, threatening the worm. Another included heating a mixture of wax, herbs, and goat fat, then dripping it near the gums to smoke the worm out. Spoiler alert, it never worked. Eventually, you'd come to accept the truth not about worms, but about belief. People craved a reason for their pain, no matter how absurd. It was easier to imagine a hungry worm than to confront the reality of decay, disease, and death. And so, you'd continue your work, part healer, part priest, part pest control. Just another day in the world of medieval mouth monsters. You've witnessed your mentor extract dozens of teeth from wailing villagers. You've held down heads, passed instruments, and cleaned up the gruesome aftermath. But nothing, absolutely nothing, truly prepares you for the first moment you're handed the pliers. The patient is a middle-aged farmer named Edric. His tooth has been aching for a solid week. His wife reports he hasn't slept, eaten, or even prayed. Today, he's desperate enough to allow a teenager to yank it out. You try to prevent your hands from trembling as your mentor steps back and nods, arms crossed, apron stained. "Go on," he says. "Time to earn your fingers." Edric sits on a stool, knuckles white, eyes wide with fear. You mumble something that might be a prayer. He responds with something that might be his final words. You locate the tooth. A molar, blackened and cracked, with gums so swollen they look ready to explode. You position the forceps, hands slick with cold sweat. Edric tenses. "On 3, you whisper, and on 2, you twist. This is what you were instructed. Don't wait for 3, it's a form of mercy, in a way. The tooth doesn't budge. Edric screams as though he's being skinned alive because, well, in a sense, he is. You adjust your grip, pressing down harder. You hear a sickening crack, and for a fleeting moment, you believe you've succeeded, until only half the tooth emerges, the rest remaining stubbornly embedded like a jagged little dagger. Your mentor sighs. "Keep going," he instructs. The subsequent minutes are a blur of blood, guttural curses, twisting metal, and sheer panic. You finally wrench out the last fragment, nearly toppling backward from the exertion. Edric slumps forward, face pale, mouth gushing with blood. You've done it. Your hands are visibly shaking. Your apron appears as though you've slaughtered a pig, and yet Edric is alive. Sobbing, yes, but grateful in that dazed, pain-shocked manner that only a medieval peasant can be. You clean the wound with wine, pack it with herbs, and wrap his head. He thanks you with a bloody smile. You try desperately not to cry, or vomit, perhaps both. Later, your mentor claps you on the back. "Not bad," he remarks. "You only cracked the jaw a little." You sleep that night with the extracted tooth in your pocket. Your first trophy, your first scar. Once you've extracted a few teeth, you begin to perceive something that never dissipates. Not in the workroom, not on your clothing, not even in your dreams. It's the smell. At first, it subtly emerges, a faint sourness in the air. You'd initially attribute it to the stew boiling next door, or perhaps your mentor's unwashed feet. But then you'd realize it's emanating from the mouths themselves. Rotting teeth carry their own distinct stench, a gag-inducing concoction of pus, blood, fermented food, and the unmistakable tang of necrotic flesh. Every time a patient opens wide, the odor hits you like a solid wall, and it lingers. It saturates your apron, your hair, your fingernails. You start to notice other scents too. The smell of fear. It's real, sharp, and metallic, especially when your patient is sweating profusely through their tunic, eyes darting anxiously, knuckles white on the chair arms. Fear makes people smell in a very particular way. It mingles with the tooth decay, the garlic breath, the damp wool, and the faint aroma of hopelessness. No candle or bundle of herbs can cut through it. You eventually stop trying. You also begin to keep a mental tally of how many people faint before the pliers even make contact with their mouth. You learn to catch heads before they hit the floor. You become adept at predicting who will scream, who will faint, and who will attempt to flee. You even have a rope for that now. It's standard practice. Sometimes the decay is so advanced that the tooth crumbles under your instrument like moldy bread. What comes out isn't a tooth. It's merely a fragment, blackened and soft, a remnant of a past meal and a harbinger of future infection. You try not to inhale too deeply, but it's pointless. The smell is now an integral part of you. When you leave the workshop, people instinctively take a step back. Children cry when you pass them by. You've become an ominous figure in the community. One day, a merchant you assisted weeks ago walks past you in the market. He nods politely, then raises a cloth to his nose. You're accustomed to it, because in this life, you don't just carry tools and bandages. You carry the lingering scent of every open mouth you've ever reached into, and there are many more to come. By now, you've stopped perceiving mouths as mere anatomical features. You see them as battlefields, and you are sent in after the war has already ravaged them. Every patient who settles into your chair carries a grim narrative between their lips, always inscribed in decay, blood, and fractured enamel. Their mouths are utter disasters. Caverns of blackened stumps, cracked molars, exposed nerves, and gums resembling overripe fruit. Some teeth lean precariously sideways, clinging to their neighbors like drunken soldiers. Others stand isolated and jagged, yellowed with age and soft to the touch. And beneath them, the gums are swollen, inflamed, or gray with putrefaction. You've even encountered maggots, and not just on one occasion. You no longer ask questions. You simply pry the mouth open and immediately assess the damage. There are teeth that visibly wiggle when the patient breathes, others that explode into fragments the moment your tool makes contact. You've seen mouths where not a single tooth remains intact, just roots protruding from pus-filled craters. And then there are the infections, Sweet heavens, boils beneath the tongue, cysts behind the molars, entire jaws that throb with every heartbeat. You once drained a pocket of pus the size of a walnut. The man thanked you through his tears. That was considered a good day. You work rapidly, not primarily for efficiency, but because the longer you gaze, the more horrifying the situation appears. These aren't dental appointments. They're triage sessions. You don't repair. You remove, scrape, and pray. You keep a bucket for discarded teeth. It invariably fills by midday. The odor strikes you before the weight does. You begin to recognize people solely by their oral condition. Ah yes, the blacksmith with the abscess under his tongue. The baker whose gums bleed when he blinks. The widow with the 7 remaining roots, all pointing in disparate directions. It has become your new normal. You attempt to maintain detachment, but every so often someone leans back, opens wide, and what you behold sends a chill down your spine. Not because it's worse than usual, but because you recognize a similar affliction within yourself. That throbbing back molar you feel at night? It looks eerily familiar. You're no longer just the healer of ruined mouths. You're a ticking jaw, awaiting your turn in that very same chair. By now, you've ceased flinching at screams. In fact, you barely register them. They're the consistent soundtrack of your profession, echoing off stone walls and wooden beams like a macabre choir of pain and regret. Each shriek is distinct, some high-pitched and panicked, others low and guttural, like a wounded animal. You once offered solace, a warm cloth, a whispered prayer, a comforting lie about how this wouldn't hurt much. That ceased after your 5th extraction, the one where the man bit through your glove and wept uncontrollably throughout the entire process. Now there's no attempt to sugarcoat it. You possess no sugar anyway, just pliers, leather straps, and the profound emotional distance that only a medieval dentist can develop. You have no anesthesia. You often don't even have numbing herbs. What you do have is a bottle of wine to dull the edge of perception, and if they're fortunate, someone to hold them down, preferably a spouse or a strong neighbor who doesn't object to blood on their sleeves. The procedure is straightforward. You wedge open the mouth, locate the offending tooth, then twist, pull, or bash, depending on its stubbornness. The patient howls, thrashes, cries out to long-dead saints, and you relentlessly continue, because if you stop, the agony only intensifies. Some scream before you even make physical contact. Others become rigid and silent, a stillness that indicates they are too terrified to even breathe. You've encountered fainting spells, vomiting, and even involuntary bodily functions mid-procedure, and you've worked through every single instance. Sometimes they scream your name, not in gratitude, but with curses. You've been branded a demon, a butcher, a devil in boots. One man swore you were sent by hell to punish gluttons with iron pincers. You interpreted it as a compliment. And afterward, most patients don't offer thanks. They stumble away clutching their face, dripping blood, and muttering oaths. A few nod, fewer still pay. Those who survive with their jaw intact are the closest you'll get to a 5-star review. But no one ever forgets you, because in a world devoid of comfort, you are the one who exchanges intense pain for slightly less pain, and people will always scream for that bargain. It was inevitable. You've handled dozens, perhaps hundreds, of screaming, flailing patients. You've deftly avoided knees, elbows, and even one unintentional headbutt from a panicked nun. But nothing truly prepares you for the moment of the bite. It begins like any other procedure. A local miller, sweating and snarling through a swollen cheek, enters your workshop clutching his jaw as if it's about to detach. Just get it out. He growls, a classic tough guy. You position him, offer your customary half prayer, and begin inspecting the molar. A genuine mess. Black, cracked, barely clinging to his gum. You don't even need the pliers yet. You simply prod with your finger to assess its mobility. That's when it happens. He clamps down forcefully. Your finger is trapped between 2 decaying teeth, and suddenly, you comprehend what genuine pain truly feels like. You scream. He screams. Someone else in the waiting room screams in sympathetic horror. You attempt to pull away, but it's too late. His jaw locks with desperate force. He's not attacking you. He's consumed by panic. But your skin disregards intentions. It's breaking. Blood fills your glove. Your mentor rushes in, attempting to pry his mouth open with the blunt end of the tooth key. It eventually works. You stagger backward, clutching your hand as if it's aflame. One of your fingertips is torn, the nail half gone. Your hand swells immediately. There's no antiseptic, of course, just wine, boiled water, and the silent hope that God isn't in a vengeful mood today. You wrap it tightly and continue working. There are still 5 more extractions on the schedule, and you need the coins. By nightfall, your hand is red and throbbing. Infection sets in swiftly because, surprise, human mouths are teeming with horrors. You develop a fever. For 2 days, you hallucinate conversations with the Virgin Mary about molars. Eventually, you recover, mostly. Your finger never quite bends correctly again. A permanent reminder. The miller? He sends you bread once a year, consumed by guilt and now toothless. From that day forward, you work differently, faster, with increased caution. And you begin using a metal probe instead of your finger to test a loose tooth, because in your line of work, the most dangerous bite isn't from dogs. You'd assume that nobles, with their silk robes and feathered hats, would possess superior teeth. They do not. In fact, the wealthier they are, the worse their mouths tend to be. Why? Because they can afford luxuries the poor never taste. Sugar, candied fruits, imported wines, and pastries so sweet, they practically melt the enamel off your teeth on contact. You're summoned to grand manor houses and castles where the floors are polished, but the smiles are horrifying. Behind powdered faces and perfumed robes lurk mouths in full rebellion. Abscesses the size of walnuts, gums like bruised fruit, and teeth so blackened you wonder if they've been cursed. And yet, nobles expect grace, elegance, and absolute discretion. They recline on velvet cushions while you kneel beside them, peering into jaws that resemble a battlefield steeped in honey and decay. They demand that you work quietly, quickly, and if possible, without explicitly stating what you are extracting. One noblewoman insists her tooth is only resting improperly. You remove it in 3 bleeding pieces. They don't scream like peasants. No, they groan theatrically. They faint with a dramatic flourish. They complain that the herbal rinse is too bitter or the linen too scratchy. One lord even demanded you pause the extraction so he could compose himself with a poem. And then there's the cosmetic dentistry, because if a noble loses a front tooth, it simply must be concealed or replaced. You've filled gaps with wax, painted teeth with white lead, which, yes, is toxic, and once carved a prosthetic canine from ivory that promptly fell out during a banquet. They pay well, at least coins, chickens, rings, even a cloak once, though it smelled like a wet dog. But they also expect special favors. Secrets kept and egos flattered. You don't mind, because every time a baron or duchess opens their mouth expecting perfection, and you gaze inside to see the same festering trench as any beggar in the street, it reinforces an important truth. Decay is democratic. It doesn't discriminate based on wealth. And you are the great equalizer. Pliers in hand, ready to remind everyone that beneath the silk and titles, they all decompose in the same manner. By this point, your reputation precedes you, but not in the way you might have desired. You enter a tavern, and conversations abruptly cease. Children duck behind their mothers. A man once spat at your feet and made the sign of the cross, muttering something about plague demons. Another crafted a charm to wear around his neck, hoping to ward off your perceived curse. You're not a hero. You're not even truly a healer. You're the tooth man, and that carries a sinister connotation for the villagers. You're a necessary evil like famine or taxes. They only approach you when the pain outweighs their absolute terror. No one visits a medieval dentist casually. They wait until they're desperate, delirious, half consumed by infection. Then they appear at your door, trembling, hat in hand. You attempt to be gentle at first, but gentleness becomes irrelevant the moment they spot the pliers. Fear takes over. Some flinch when you speak, others avoid eye contact. The bravest ones offer a nervous smile, revealing whatever teeth they still possess. No one celebrates your work when you perform it well. They scream, When you perform it poorly, they scream more intensely. If you save a life, it's quickly forgotten. If you mishandle an extraction, it becomes legendary. One woman claimed you removed the wrong tooth. You didn't, but the story spread anyway until you were known as the man who steals molars for fun. A group of boys once followed you through town, singing a crude little song. One for the farmer, two for the priest, hide your teeth or he'll make a feast. You laugh because you have no other choice, but it stings. You never wanted to be feared. You simply wanted to help. Still, fear has its advantages. People pay more quickly, they listen intently. No one questions your fee when they suspect you might extract the wrong tooth just to make a point. And when someone collapses in the street from an abscessed jaw, you're the first person they summon. Not because they trust you, but because you're their only recourse. So you roll up your sleeves, open your kit, and step into the ring once more. You're not loved. You're not even particularly liked, but you are remembered. When the plague descends, dentistry takes a backseat to sheer survival. The Black Death has no concern for cavities. It saturates the streets with fevered bodies and leaves you contemplating whether that abscessed jaw is merely an abscess or the ominous beginning of the end. Still, people come to you, they always do. Not because you're a miracle worker, but because you've handled pus before. You've witnessed swelling, drained putrefaction, and packed wounds with herbs. You've watched people scream themselves hoarse from jaw infections. So, what's one more plague boil between acquaintances? Your work shifts from routine extractions to emergency lancing. Swollen necks, blackened gums, lymph nodes the size of chicken eggs. You heat your blade, grip the skin, and slice. Pus erupts like a burst blistered fruit. You no longer gag. You haven't in years. Sometimes they live, sometimes they don't. You begin to keep a grim tally in chalk marks on your door, not out of vanity, but to prevent your mind from unraveling. Payment becomes unusual now. Nobody has coins, so they offer bread, dried meat, or promises they won't live long enough to fulfill. A dying merchant gives you a ring. A widow gives you her late husband's boots. You sell what you can, bury what you must. The smells intensify. Your workshop transforms into a hybrid clinic and crypt. You stack firewood for warmth, but it provides no comfort. The chill is deeper now, in your bones, in the profound silence that descends when 3 consecutive patients never rise again. Still, you're busy. The plague is devastating for the body, but paradoxically beneficial for business, and people whisper about you. The one who drained the poison from my neighbor's neck. The one who pulled 3 infected teeth and the man survived. The one who might possess knowledge the priests do not. You don't correct them because in a time when everyone is dying, being slightly less deadly bestows a form of power. So you continue cutting, draining, packing wounds with mold and prayer. You don't sleep much. You don't speak unless necessary. But you're alive and working. In the age of plague, you're no longer just the person with pliers. You're the one they summon when it's almost too late. It begins with a dull ache, seemingly minor, a persistent throb in your back molar after a long day, easily dismissed. But you understand the signs. You've witnessed this same narrative 100 times in countless mouths. It always starts insignificantly, then it consumes everything. At first, you pretend it's mere fatigue. You gargle with wine. You chew on cloves. You discreetly rub your jaw when no one is observing. But deep down, you know the decay has come for you. You attempt to work through the pain. After all, there are mouths in worse condition than yours. Peasants completely toothless, nobles whose breath causes flowers to wilt. You've endured the screams of others. Surely you can endure your own. But the pain intensifies relentlessly, creeps up your jaw, into your ear, behind your eye. You stop eating. You stop speaking. You begin to dream obsessively about the tooth. The same one, repeatedly, falling out, growing worms, whispering to you in Latin. You consider asking your apprentice for assistance, but he's too inexperienced. He still hesitates. He still wipes his tools on his sleeve. So one night, in the dim light of your own workshop, you perform the act you've executed for years. You extract your own tooth. You wedge a wooden block between your molars, steady your hands, and reach in with the pliers. You've performed this procedure hundreds of times. You know precisely how to grip, twist, and remove, but you've never done it to yourself. The pain is indescribable, not because it's necessarily worse, but because it's intimately yours. You groan, a sound half rage, half agony. Sweat beads on your tunic. You taste blood, then more blood, and then finally a measure of relief. Sort of. You drop the tooth into your tin bowl. It clatters alongside the others. For a moment, you stare at it. It's just another ruined thing in a room full of them. You clean the wound. You don't pack it, not from oversight, but from pride. You'll heal or you won't. It's always been that way. The physical pain subsides, but something else lingers, because for the first time, you truly understand what every scream you ever heard really meant. And now you carry that understanding, not just in your hands, but in your own empty jaw. There's no grand finale for a medieval dentist. No cathedral burial, no gilded plaque, no choir singing praises of extracted molars and drained abscesses. Just an old man in a blood-stained apron, hunched over his workbench, tools worn down to crooked metal nubs. Your hands constantly ache now. Your knees grind like worn teeth. Your vision blurs in the evenings, and your ears ring with echoes of 1,000 past screams. Patients still come, but you move more slowly, you speak less frequently. You grip the pliers with fingers that no longer close without pain. One day you reach for bread and feel it. A crack, a soft crumbling sensation in your mouth. Another tooth gone. Your own again. You don't bother saving it. You've lost count. You no longer eat apples. You drink your meals now, chewing only when absolutely necessary. Your tongue explores the gaps in your mouth like a soldier traversing a ruined battlefield. Fewer survivors remain each year. You wonder sometimes if the villagers will remember you after you're gone. The man who carried the scent of death on his breath and mercy in his hands. The one who extracted more teeth than most people ever had in their heads. But truthfully, they won't construct a tomb for you. You're not a priest. You're not a knight. You're simply the man who helped them scream a little less. Your grave will be shallow, your name perhaps scratched onto a wooden plank. Maybe not at all. But the work you performed, it continues to live on. In every mouth that still chews without agony. In every child who didn't succumb to a jaw infection. In every noble who concealed their decay behind a painted smile and never once offered thanks. And in the bucket of teeth beneath your workbench rests a silent monument to a life of blood, rust, and exposed nerves. When you finally die, there will be no mourning procession, just a profound silence in the workshop and an odor that lingers for a day too long. Eventually, someone else will pick up the pliers. Someone younger, more ambitious, less haunted. The screams will inevitably return. But for now, your hands grow still, your breath fades, and somewhere in the village, a child will feel a sharp pain in their tooth. They'll ask, "Where's the man who makes it stop?" But you'll be gone. No tombstone, just the memory of gums. Before the invention of silk, before linen, before anything remotely resembling a fashion statement, there was simply skin. Human skin exposed to the sun, wind, cold, insects, and every other force nature could inflict. In the earliest chapters of human history, clothing wasn't about style. It was entirely about survival. The very first humans inhabited harsh, unforgiving environments, and they had to quickly become resourceful if they wanted to make it through the night. The solution, whatever materials were readily available. Animal hides from the hunt, pliable tree bark, woven reeds, and even grass twisted into rudimentary belts and skirts. It wasn't aesthetically pleasing, but it functioned. And it was at this primal stage that clothing was born. These weren't outfits, they were protective barriers. The fur of a predator might offer warmth in winter, but it also made you smell like a potential meal to the next hungry lion. Still, for early humans, warmth far outweighed aesthetics. We wrapped ourselves in raw skins, tying them together with sinew or vines, and hoping for the best. But over time, even these crude coverings began to acquire symbolic significance. The person wearing the largest bear hide? Likely the one who successfully hunted it. The woman with the intricately woven grass skirt? Perhaps she was the revered elder, the storyteller, the healer. Clothing began to signify more than just protection. it subtly communicated status. The earliest archaeological evidence of clothing tools, specifically bone needles, dates back nearly 40,000 years, suggesting that early humans were already tailoring animal hides into more fitted garments. That indicates not just functionality, but thoughtful design and human ingenuity. And once we started migrating to different climates, icy tundras, scorching deserts, humid jungles, our clothing evolved accordingly. In cold regions, layered furs and tight wrappings provided essential insulation for our bodies. In hot climates, we transitioned toward breathable, loosely draped fabrics. This was more than mere invention. It was precise adaptation. So while it's tempting to imagine early humans running wild and unrestrained, the reality is far more practical. From the moment we began covering ourselves, clothing became our earliest form of technology. A quiet revolution woven from fiber and fur, stitched together by necessity and just a hint of nascent pride. And this was only the beginning. When we imagine ancient Egypt, we typically picture majestic pyramids, golden death masks, and gods with animal heads. But if you look closer, you'll notice something else. Everyone is impeccably dressed in linen. Not silk, not wool, linen. And not just any linen. It was smooth, bleached, and immaculately pleated. Egypt's hot, dry climate made linen the perfect fabric. It was light, breathable, and could be worn in layers without trapping too much heat. Made from the flax plant, producing linen required significant effort. First, the flax was harvested, soaked, and repeatedly beaten, then spun into fine threads, and finally woven into fabric. This was not casual wear. Linen was labor-intensive and therefore highly valuable. Pharaohs wore it, priests wore it, and even the deceased were dressed in it, mummified in layer after layer of meticulously prepared linen wrappings. Egyptians believed clothing held importance not just in life, but also in death. Your attire helped secure your identity in the afterlife. A well-wrapped mummy wasn't just fashionable. It was spiritually fortified. Social status was quite literally woven into what you wore. The elite flaunted semi-transparent linen tunics, often pleated or dyed pure white, a color associated with purity and divine power. Ordinary workers wore simpler kilts, sometimes little more than a wrapped cloth tied with a belt. But even they appreciated linen's cool elegance. Children often wore nothing until puberty, but even their first garment marked a significant rite of passage. Jewelry, of course, completed the ensemble. Wide collars made of faience and gold, lapis lazuli amulets, and beaded sandals. A nobleman's wardrobe might include elaborate wigs, kohl-lined eyes, and perfumed cones that slowly melted over the head at lavish banquets. Fashion in Egypt wasn't superficial. It was intertwined with ritual, identity, and social rank. Priests, who needed to maintain ritual cleanliness, wore only the finest white linen and strictly avoided anything of animal origin. No wool, no leather. Clothing was not just fabric. It was a form of spiritual armor, separating the sacred from the profane. Even slaves and servants had specific clothing suited to their tasks, though rarely with adornment. Yet whether they worked in the fields or attended the palace, linen defined Egyptian fashion for thousands of years. So while other civilizations were still bundling themselves in animal skins and wool, Egypt was pioneering one of humanity's first fabric revolutions. Smooth, sunlit, and stitched into eternity. If Egypt spun gold from flax, Mesopotamia meticulously wove its civilization in wool. In the fertile lands nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the earliest city-states were also among the earliest trendsetters. Their signature fashion involved draped robes, wide belts, and multiple layers of wool, the textile pride of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria. Here, wool was more than just clothing. It was the backbone of their economy. Sheep were ubiquitous, and their fleece was crucial for Mesopotamian trade, temple offerings, and taxation. In fact, temple complexes managed vast flocks and textile production like miniature empires. Clothing was centralized, sacred, and bureaucratic all at once. The typical attire for men was the konakes, a wraparound skirt or tunic often made from tufted wool, giving it a shaggy, pelt-like appearance. At first glance, it might seem as if someone simply skinned a sheep and wore it untrimmed. That isn't far from the truth in its initial form, but over time it became a stylized ceremonial garment, even a royal one. Kings, priests, and deities were frequently depicted wearing convex robes, signifying its prestige. Women's garments were similarly draped, but sometimes extended to the ankles with one shoulder exposed, practical yet refined. These outfits were not sewn or tailored with the precision of Egyptian linen. Instead, they were draped and pinned, shaped more by artistic arrangement than by stitching. Social class dictated the finer details. Elites wore fine, dyed wool, rich indigos, deep reds, sometimes adorned with fringe or intricate embroidery. Servants and laborers wore coarser versions, and like in Egypt, children often went nude until a certain age. Modesty, after all, was a flexible concept in early civilizations. Mesopotamians also favored wide belts or girdles, often crafted from leather or wool cords, to secure their garments. These belts were status symbols, sometimes embellished with bronze studs or inscribed with names, prayers, or symbols of divine protection. Headwear was common, especially among men. Conical hats, headbands, and turbans indicated identity and status. Soldiers and messengers might wear simple leather caps, while priests and royalty sported more elaborate coverings. Jewelry completed the look. Earrings, bracelets, and necklaces made of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and carnelian. Even the poorest often wore at least a simple bead or amulet for protection. So while Egypt flowed with linen, Mesopotamia confidently wore wool, raw, warm, and laden with meaning. Their draped style wasn't just about fabric. It was about power, piety, and the world's very first carefully curated wardrobes. While Egypt mastered linen and Mesopotamia flaunted wool, the people of the Indus Valley quietly revolutionized clothing with something soft, breathable, and remarkably advanced for its time: cotton. Yes, actual spun and woven cotton, and they achieved this over 5,000 years ago. Centered around cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, the Indus Valley civilization left behind no grand temples or royal tombs, but it did leave hints of a highly organized, hygienic, and fashion-conscious society. Their clothing was clean, minimal, and functional, perfectly suited to the hot, humid climate of what is now modern-day Pakistan and northwest India. The evidence we have comes from terracotta figurines, seal impressions, and some impressively detailed sculptures. Men typically wore a short kilt or a wrapped cloth tied at the waist, while women draped longer garments, sometimes over one shoulder. Think of it as an early precursor to the sari. Both genders wore minimal but elegant clothing, always designed for ease of movement and to combat the heat. And yes, they were the first civilization known to cultivate cotton. This wasn't merely resourceful. It was revolutionary. Cotton's breathability and softness made it ideal for daily life, especially in contrast to the heavier, animal-based fibers used in other regions. The Indus people spun it, wove it, and likely dyed it using natural pigments, perhaps indigo or turmeric, both of which were readily available in the region. Simplicity did not equate to dullness. Many figurines depict women adorned with elaborate jewelry, bangles extending up the arms, earrings, and beaded necklaces. Hair was often styled or braided, and decorative combs and cosmetic containers have been discovered in excavations, suggesting regular grooming rituals. There's even a famous bronze sculpture known as the Dancing Girl, dating back to around 2500 BCE. She wears nothing but a handful of bangles, yet her pose, confidence, and adornment speak volumes about the cultural comfort with both grace and minimalism. What's striking is how little waste and excess seem to have characterized Indus fashion. There was no obsession with grandiosity, just well-made, locally sourced, climate-appropriate clothing that seamlessly integrated into daily life. No gold-studded robes or thick layers, just the inherent elegance of clean lines and ingenious fabric use. In the quiet streets of Harappa, fashion wasn't ostentatious, but it was light years ahead of its time. By the time the Minoans rose to prominence around 2000 BCE on the island of Crete, fashion had undergone a dramatic transformation from modest functionality to something far more expressive and, frankly, magnificent. The Minoans didn't simply wear clothes to survive the Mediterranean climate. They used clothing to captivate, to facilitate movement, to entice, and perhaps most importantly, to dance. Minoan clothing was light and vibrant, tailored not only for the heat, but for visual impact. Men typically wore loincloths or kilts, sometimes elaborate with patterned sashes, other times bare-chested with tight belts emphasizing the waist. But it was the women's fashion that truly commanded attention. Depictions from Minoan frescoes, such as those at Knossos, showcase women wearing garments unlike anything seen in other ancient cultures. Fitted bodices with flounced, layered skirts, sometimes bell-shaped, often tiered, and remarkably open fronts that left the breasts exposed. No, not by accident. This was a deliberate fashion choice, possibly for ritualistic purposes, possibly indicating status, and certainly intentional. These corset-like tops created an hourglass silhouette for women, cinching the waist while allowing complete freedom of movement. The skirts swayed dramatically with every step, especially during the athletic dances and religious ceremonies for which Minoans were renowned. Clothing here wasn't static, it was dynamic. Every layer, fold, and color contributed to the impression of motion. The fabrics were likely linen or wool, dyed in bright blues, reds, yellows, and purples using plant-based pigments. Decorative borders, intricate embroidery, and perhaps even imported threads added visual appeal. Minoan tailors clearly possessed a keen sense of style. They weren't just cutting cloth, they were sculpting identity. Both men and women adorned themselves with jewelry, necklaces, bracelets, and elaborate earrings often crafted from gold, silver, and semi-precious stones like carnelian and turquoise. Hair was kept long and meticulously styled, sometimes curled or braided with elaborate headdresses or hats for ceremonial occasions. Even children were dressed with care, indicating that clothing played a role not just in function but in the performance of status, age, and role within society. And given the prominence of women in Minoan art, their elaborate clothing may have symbolized more than mere beauty. It may have conveyed authority. The Minoans brought fashion off the loom and onto the stage, transforming every hem into a piece of theater and every outfit into a living sculpture in motion. In ancient China, clothing was never simply fabric. It was interwoven with philosophy, hierarchy, and served as an instrument of imperial control. And at the heart of it all, silk. Glorious, shimmering silk, so highly prized that people once believed it was spun directly from the gods. In truth, it originated from the unassuming silkworm, but the impact of its discovery would ripple across continents and centuries. The origins of silk production date back to the Neolithic period, with the earliest confirmed evidence from around 2700 BCE. According to legend, Empress Lezu was the first to unravel a cocoon that had accidentally fallen into her tea, thus discovering the delicate filament within. Whether factual or not, silk production quickly became one of China's most closely guarded secrets, revealing how to make it was punishable by death. By the Shang and Zhou dynasties, silk had already become the defining characteristic of Chinese sophistication. Unlike rough wool or stiff linen, silk flowed gracefully, light, cool, and luminous. It was perfectly suited for China's varied climates, and it absorbed dyes beautifully. Imperial yellows, deep reds, and bold blues were woven into intricate patterns. Dragons for emperors, clouds for scholars, and waves for courtiers. Clothing became explicitly codified by class. The more silk you wore, the higher your social rank. The cut, color, and even sleeve length could signal everything from your social standing to your specific occupation. Commoners were forbidden from wearing certain colors or weaves, while members of the nobility glided through palaces in robes that practically whispered power with every step. The Han Dynasty, 206 BC, 220 CE, elevated silk to a diplomatic weapon. Bolts of silk were traded with nomadic tribes, offered as tribute, and eventually sent westward along the Silk Road, giving the route its enduring name. Chinese clothing, especially among elites, now featured wide-sleeved robes, sashes, and multiple layers. The way a robe folded, with the left side overlapping the right, became a matter of profound cultural identity. Women's fashion included high-waisted skirts, long flowing sleeves, and elaborate hairpins. Men's garments emphasized grace and humility, aligning with Confucian ideals. Clothing was expected to reflect inner virtue and cosmic balance. Silk wasn't just a luxury. It was a silent yet absolute language. In ancient China, what you wore wasn't just about your appearance. It signified who you were, how you thought, and where you belonged. In ancient Greece, fashion didn't demand attention loudly. It flowed, rapped, and whispered elegance. The Greeks weren't preoccupied with tailoring or intricate stitching. Their approach to clothing was architectural, even sculptural. With a single length of cloth, they created garments that expressed movement, intellect, and grace. No scissors, no seams, just geometry, skillful drapery, and a deep respect for natural form. The fundamental Greek garment was the chiton, a rectangular piece of linen or wool, folded and pinned at the shoulders with brooches or fibulae, then belted at the waist. Depending on the material and how it was draped, the chiton could be light and airy for daily wear or formal and layered for special occasions. Men wore it knee-length, women ankle-length. It was a versatile canvas of identity, adaptable to age, gender, and specific events. Over this, citizens might wear a himation, a heavier cloak wrapped over one shoulder, useful for warmth, modesty, or dramatic effect, depending on how it was styled. Think of it as a wearable toga, a symbol of dignity and contemplation, often associated with philosophers, statesmen, and elders. The Greeks believed that clothing should mirror inner virtue. Simplicity was celebrated, while extravagance was generally frowned upon, especially in Athens where public modesty was considered a civic virtue. Spartan men were even more rigorous, often going barefoot and cloaked in coarse red wool, emphasizing austerity over appearance. But don't let the apparent simplicity mislead you. Greek garments could be stunning. Wealthier citizens wore dyed and embroidered chitons in saffron, indigo, or crimson, adorned with meander patterns and mythological motifs. Jewelry, elaborate hairstyling, and subtle cosmetics enhanced the overall look. Women decorated their hair with ribbons, tiaras, or intricate braids. Men meticulously groomed their beards with as much pride as their rhetoric. Footwear was often optional. Sandals were common, but many Greeks preferred to go barefoot, especially in temples or at symposia. Clothing wasn't just for covering the body. It was a subtle conversation with society. A well-draped himation could express nobility. A disheveled chiton might signal mourning or madness. Greek statues, often modeled after living individuals, preserved the intricate folds of these garments in marble. Even gods were depicted wearing chitons and cloaks, reminding mortals that beauty resided in form, not merely in the flesh. In the end, Greek fashion wasn't about what you wore, but how you wore it, with thoughtful consideration, with poise, and above all, with a philosophy woven into every elegant fold. If the Greeks enveloped their identity in flowing elegance, the Romans meticulously tailored theirs into a symbol of order. Roman clothing wasn't just about comfort or aesthetic appeal. It was law, it signified rank, and it encapsulated Romanitas, Roman identity, through its very construction. What you wore in Rome explicitly communicated to the world precisely who you were, your level of power, and even your designated seat in the Senate. The most iconic Roman garment was the toga, a massive, semicircular woolen cloth, up to 20 feet long, draped meticulously around the body. It was bulky, impractical, and required considerable practice to wear correctly, but that was precisely its purpose. Only male Roman citizens were permitted to wear the toga. It served as a powerful symbol of Roman citizenship and, by extension, Roman superiority. Togas varied in style and color based on your social status. The toga virilis was plain white, worn by adult male citizens. The toga praetexta, distinguished by a purple border, was reserved for magistrates and certain priests. And the toga picta, dyed entirely purple with gold embroidery, was exclusively for emperors and triumphant generals. Purple dye, extracted from the murex sea snail, was so incredibly expensive it was virtually worth its weight in gold. However, most Romans did not wear togas daily. The tunica, a simple belted garment made of wool or linen, was the common everyday attire. Short for men, long for women. Slaves and laborers wore basic, unadorned tunics, while senators had theirs marked with broad purple stripes, latus clavis. Even the precise width of a stripe could distinguish a senator from a knight. Women wore stoli, long, sleeveless dresses often layered over a tunic, tied at the shoulders and belted at the waist. Married women covered their heads with a palla, a rectangular shawl that added both modesty and versatility. For upper-class women, appearance was a key element of power. Fabrics became increasingly colorful, jewelry more elaborate, and hairstyles more towering with each passing dynasty. Romans also placed great importance on footwear. Sandals, boots, and indoor slippers reflected one's societal position. A soldier's caligy was distinctly different from a senator's red shoes. Even the enslaved had designated attire, typically a rough tunic, though they could be dressed well if their master wished to display his wealth. In Rome, nothing was accidental. Even your clothing was a bold proclamation of citizenship, class, gender, morality, and ambition, all meticulously wrapped in wool, secured with a brooch, and publicly displayed like a walking scroll of status. As the Roman Empire slowly crumbled and its iconic togas unraveled, a new wave of fashion emerged from the so-called barbarians, a term the Romans used for anyone beyond their established borders. But these external groups, Goths, Franks, Celts, Saxons, and Vandals, were not uncivilized brutes dressed in rags. Their clothing was not only practical but in many ways a direct precursor to the medieval wardrobe that would follow. The northern European climate was harsh, far too cold and muddy for the open tunics and flowing togas favored by the Romans. Consequently, barbarian fashion prioritized warmth, freedom of movement, and utility. Thick and insulating cloaks, practical trousers, long-sleeved tunics, and fur-lined boots were standard attire, perfectly tailored for riding horses, traversing dense forests, and engaging in warfare. One of the most significant innovations they introduced to the world of fashion: pants. That's right, the trousers we now consider everyday essentials were a foreign concept to the toga-wrapped Romans. Initially viewed with disdain, pants became indispensable as Roman soldiers adopted them for fighting in colder regions. Eventually, they spread into common use throughout Europe. Men typically wore braci, an early form of trousers, with a tunic and often a belt or leather harness across the chest. Women wore layered wool dresses with long sleeves, often cinched at the waist, and draped cloaks fastened with ornate brooches or pins. Colorful dyes were popular: reds, blues, and greens derived from plants and minerals, and patterns like checks or stripes began to appear, foreshadowing the later Celtic tartans. Clothing also served to communicate allegiance and tribal identity. Brooches, belt buckles, and fibulae were not just functional. They bore intricate symbols of lineage, mythology, or rank. The Celts, for example, created elaborate metalwork that beautifully integrated art with attire. Hair and grooming styles varied. Long hair and beards were common for warriors, women favored braided styles, and some Celtic tribes even practiced facial tattooing. Jewelry crafted from bronze, amber, and glass was common, worn by both genders. By the time the Western Roman Empire eventually fell, the so-called barbarian dress had firmly laid the foundation for medieval European clothing. Layered, woolen, and built for the realities of daily life. Less about elaborate ceremony, more about practical survival, yet still rich with cultural meaning, beauty, and national pride. And so, from the simple linen kilts of pharaohs to the practical woolen cloaks of early kings, ancient clothing stitched together far more than mere bodies. It artfully wove together entire civilizations. Queen Tati was born into a world consumed by conflict, not by literal flames, but by intense ambition, rampant betrayal, and the relentless clash of empires vying for control over the fragile backbone of the Levant. Her homeland, the Amurru Kingdom, was not a vast empire like Egypt or the Hittites. It was small, fractured, and perpetually trapped between larger powers that saw it less as a sovereign nation and more as a convenient buffer zone. Situated in what is now western Syria and northern Lebanon, Amurru was a land of rolling hills, vital trade routes, and constantly shifting loyalties. By the time Tati was born, likely in the 14th century BCE, the kingdom was already a diplomatic pawn, exchanged between Egyptian pharaohs, Mitanni warlords, and the ever-expanding Hittite kings. It was a challenging place to rule, yet strategically crucial. Tati's early life would have been shaped by intricate court intrigues, visits from foreign emissaries, and the constant dread of invasion or internal rebellion. Whether she was born into the royal family or married into it, she would have been trained from a young age in the arts of diplomacy, survival, and ceremonial leadership. In Amuru, a queen was not merely decorative. She was a skilled negotiator, a symbol of stability, and sometimes the crucial link holding a fractured court together. The region itself was in a state of flux. The once powerful Mitanni kingdom was collapsing, steadily losing territory and influence to the ascendant Hittites. Egypt, under the reigns of Amenhotep III and later Akhenaten, still considered Amuru within its sphere of influence. Meanwhile, local rulers continuously weighed their options. Should they swear allegiance to Egypt, risk aligning with the Hittites, or attempt to play both sides against each other? Tati came of age amidst this storm. As a woman in a political landscape dominated by men, her rise to visible power is inherently remarkable. The very fact that she was mentioned in Hittite diplomatic records, official correspondence between kings, suggests not only her status but her undeniable authority. She was not a mere background figure. She was actively present at the negotiating table. Though the historical record is sparse, her name itself reveals something profound. In an era when most women were absent from stone inscriptions and clay tablets, Queen Tati ensured her presence was known. And that was only the beginning of her story. In the late Bronze Age, diplomacy was often brutal, and alliances rarely endured beyond a single harvest season. Yet Queen Tati appears in historical records not as a mere footnote, but as a named political figure, an almost unheard-of occurrence for a woman of this period. She is referenced in Hittite diplomatic archives, specifically within correspondence concerning the destiny of Amuru. Her very mention speaks volumes. The context of her appearance in these records is crucial. Around the time Tati ascended to prominence, Amuru's ruling elite faced a critical decision: whether to remain loyal to the weakening Egyptian grip or to align with the rising Hittite empire. This was no trivial choice. Egypt had long claimed Amuru as a vassal territory. The Hittites, however, were expanding aggressively, systematically peeling off Egypt's northern allies one by one. It is within this precarious political game that Tati's name emerges. The Hittites were negotiating terms with Amuru's leadership, and Tati was actively involved. Some interpretations of the Hittite texts suggest that she may have functioned as a regent or co-ruler, perhaps during a period of succession crisis or possibly even as the widow of a former king. In any case, her role was not ceremonial. She possessed enough influence that the most powerful empire in the Near East at the time, the Hittites, felt compelled to acknowledge her. Tati's political weight also points to something deeper: the adaptable and pragmatic nature of power in Amuru. Unlike Egypt or Assyria, where royal women were largely excluded from governance, smaller kingdoms sometimes permitted or required queens to step into leadership roles when dynastic lines faltered, or when political survival necessitated broader alliances. We have no idea what Tati looked like. No statues, busts, or paintings of her exist, but in the dusty lines of clay cuneiform, we find something more meaningful: undeniable evidence of her influence. She stood her ground in an arena filled with kings, ambassadors, generals, and warlords. In an era where marriages forged treaties and betrayal was always a possibility, Tati's presence in diplomatic documents clearly shows she wasn't a mere pawn. She was a significant player. To truly grasp Queen Tati's world is to understand a whirlwind of complex power politics. Her kingdom, Amuru, was like a fragile stone caught between three enormous, grinding tectonic plates: the Hittite Empire emerging from Anatolia, Egypt asserting its dominion from the south, and the crumbling Mitanni kingdom to the east. Tati's rule unfolded in the constant shadow of their rivalries, each empire presenting a distinct kind of threat or opportunity. Egypt, under the late 18th dynasty, had long considered Amuru a part of its imperial network. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Amenhotep III had installed local vassals, demanded tribute, and expected unwavering obedience. Yet the Egyptian grip on the northern Levant had begun to weaken, particularly during the religious upheaval of Akhenaten's reign. Egypt was distracted, vulnerable, and preoccupied with divine matters instead of military strategy. Meanwhile, the Mitanni, once a significant power in the region, were rapidly declining. Internal strife and military defeats had exposed them to invasions from both the east and the north. Their former allies watched closely. Amurru, once a Mitanni vassal, found itself increasingly isolated. Then came the Hittites. Under the brilliant and utterly ruthless leadership of Suppiluliuma I, this king was not content with merely ruling Anatolia. He had set his sights firmly on the Syrian corridor, including Amurru. Suppiluliuma launched military campaigns deep into the Levant, systematically breaking down Mitanni resistance and seizing one city-state after another. His objective was simple: control the crucial trade routes, neutralize Egypt's lingering influence, and bring strategic regions like Amurru into his formidable sphere. This was the complex world Tati navigated, a power triangle, each point burning with fierce ambition. She could not afford any missteps. Choosing Egypt risked severe Hittite retribution. Aligning with the Hittites might provoke local factions still loyal to the pharaoh, and attempting to ally with the decaying Mitanni was a risky gamble at best. Yet amidst this geopolitical storm, Queen Tati did not disappear. She remained politically active and visible, mentioned in Hittite negotiations, likely carefully balancing loyalties with every caravan that passed through her kingdom's mountain passes. She wasn't just surviving, she was skillfully maneuvering. Her rule or regency occurred during one of the most volatile eras of the Late Bronze Age, and instead of being crushed by the chaos, Tati appears to have skillfully utilized it, not to dominate, but to endure. At some point during Queen Tati's life, a major political event fundamentally reshaped Amurru's foreign policy. The kingdom officially switched allegiance from Egypt and aligned itself with the Hittite Empire. This pivotal decision was not made lightly. It completely redefined Amurru's position on the map, provoked strong Egyptian retaliation, and cemented the kingdom's role within one of the most intricate diplomatic networks of the entire Bronze Age. The Hittite king Suppiluliuma I, a master strategist and relentless expansionist, had already begun drawing smaller Levantine kingdoms into his sphere of influence through both military might and astute negotiation. When Amurru's leadership, very likely with Queen Tati playing a central role, agreed to switch sides, the agreement wasn't sealed with just spoken promises. It was formalized in a detailed treaty. In the Hittite cuneiform archives, this treaty survives, though its primary focus is on the male ruler of Amurru, most probably Tati's husband or a close relative. It is crucial to acknowledge that Tati's name appears in related diplomatic correspondence, indicating she was not a silent participant in these crucial discussions. She may have played a vital role in the negotiations, especially in managing the domestic repercussions and satisfying foreign expectations. The treaty outlined key obligations. Amurru would now become a vassal of the Hittite king. In exchange, the Hittites pledged protection, not only from Egypt but also from rival tribes and internal dissent. This was more than a handshake agreement. It was a pact for survival. Egypt did not accept this betrayal easily. Pharaoh Akhenaten considered the shift an act of treason. The Amarna letters, a collection of clay tablet correspondence between Egyptian officials and their vassals, strongly hint at diplomatic outrage and urgent demands for loyalty. Tati's court must have braced for swift retaliation. However, aligning with the Hittites was strategically the more intelligent choice. Suppiluliuma's military campaigns had shattered Mitanni power, and Egypt was descending into religious and political instability. Tati's decision, and yes, we must attribute it to her as well, was one of calculated realism. The treaty with the Hittites marked a significant turning point. It provided Amurru with security, but at a cost. The kingdom was no longer a neutral buffer. It had firmly chosen a side in an ongoing war of empires, and once that choice was made, there was no returning. Queen Tati didn't just observe this momentous shift, she actively helped guide it. The moment Amurru allied with the Hittite Empire, Queen Tati and her court found themselves at the very eye of a geopolitical storm. Egypt was absolutely furious. Once considered a loyal vassal state, Amurru had now, in Egyptian eyes, committed outright betrayal. And betrayal in the Bronze Age didn't merely provoke written complaints. It provoked violent retaliation. The Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and their vassals, clearly reflect this escalating tension. Egypt accused Amurru's leadership of treachery, questioned their honor, and demanded absolute obedience. While Tati's name isn't explicitly featured in these specific texts, the fact that she appears in Hittite records from the same period suggests her deep involvement in the unfolding crisis. What ensued was not just a clash of armies, but a fierce battle of loyalties. Egypt began pressuring neighboring rulers to isolate Amurru. Border skirmishes likely intensified. Tati would have faced the immense challenge of managing not only external threats but also significant internal dissent. Not everyone within Amurru agreed with the shift to the Hittites, especially those who had prospered under years of Egyptian patronage. Merchants, military leaders, and even members of the royal household may have questioned the wisdom of this new alliance. Tati had to tread very carefully. Her position was likely bolstered by her close connection to the throne, possibly as queen mother, regent, or a senior consort. Her experience and diplomatic acumen would have been vital in preserving the kingdom's unity. She wasn't just navigating battlefield strategies. She was managing the emotional complexities of betrayal, the collapse of generations-old alliances, and the psychological toll of continuous conflict. However, betrayal could also be a path to reinvention. By siding with the Hittites, Amurru acquired a new identity, transforming from a minor client of Egypt into a crucial Hittite ally in the Levant. This strategic repositioning brought with it economic advantages. Trade routes shifted, Hittite merchants and envoys arrived, and roads were secured under new terms. For Queen Tati, the aftermath of this bold betrayal was survival under immense pressure. Her legacy, preserved only in fragments, is one of delicate tightrope diplomacy. She lacked the luxury of certainty. Every decision carried the potential to spark invasion or civil unrest. Yet amidst the widespread chaos, she endured, and in the brutal logic of Bronze Age politics, enduring was often the most significant form of victory. In an era where most queens remained unnamed, unseen, and largely forgotten by official records, Queen Tati of Amurru left behind something truly extraordinary, a name inscribed in clay. Her appearance in Hittite diplomatic archives is far more than a mere footnote. It's a rare and precious glimpse into the agency and influence of a Bronze Age woman on the grand world stage. Tati is mentioned in the context of treaties and letters exchanged between Amurru and the formidable Hittite Empire, particularly during the reign of Suppiluliuma I, the master tactician of Anatolia. These records, preserved on cuneiform tablets discovered in the Royal Archive of Hattusa, clearly demonstrate that Tati was more than a ceremonial figure. She was either directly involved in critical diplomatic dealings or wielded enough power that her presence absolutely had to be acknowledged. One specific letter details the political situation in Amurru following its defection from Egyptian influence. In this letter, Tati is named alongside other significant political actors, suggesting she had a decisive voice in how the kingdom positioned itself, responded to crises, and managed its crucial alliances. Was she a queen regent during a king's minority? A widow fiercely defending her late husband's legacy? Or perhaps even the sole authority in a period of male absence? We cannot be entirely certain, but what is undeniably clear is that her name was not merely ornamental. It was operational. For the Hittites to mention a queen by name in their formal diplomatic correspondence was highly unusual. It signifies her recognized influence, perhaps even genuine respect. Hittite diplomacy was cold and pragmatic. Titles were not conferred for mere flattery. If Tati was mentioned, it was because she was an integral part of the machinery of power. This is particularly noteworthy considering that most Bronze Age international correspondence was exchanged solely between kings. Queens were typically silent allies, referenced indirectly if at all. But Tati's undeniable presence is etched into the very documents that tracked alliances, warfare, tribute, and betrayal. Through these ancient clay tablets, she speaks, not in her own recorded words, but through the crucial acknowledgement of others. That alone distinguishes her as exceptional. She lived during a period when the world resonated loudly with war and constantly shifting alliances, and yet her voice still managed to find its way into the historical record. In the often impersonal bureaucratic silence of ancient empires, Queen Tati's name echoes with a quiet, yet formidable strength. By aligning Amurru with the Hittite Empire, Queen Tati ensured her kingdom's continued existence, but not without consequence. The alliance brought not only protection but also a new layer of oversight. And at the core of that oversight was Suppiluliuma I, the commanding Hittite king who reshaped the Near East with his unwavering resolve and brilliant strategic mind. For Tati, navigating her kingdom's new position under his vigilant gaze meant treading a precarious line between genuine partnership and outright subjugation. Suppiluliuma was not a passive overlord. His control over client states like Amurru was absolute in all but official designation. He dispatched envoys, demanded tribute, and expected complete compliance. Tati and her court were expected to adhere to the terms of their treaty precisely, offering military support, safeguarding trade routes, and allowing Hittite influence to permeate their administration. It's highly probable that Tati had to host Hittite advisors at her court, and perhaps even had Hittite troops stationed nearby. Her decisions, both regarding foreign policy and domestic affairs, were no longer entirely her own. However, she was not powerless. Tati's true skill lay not in openly defying Suppiluliuma, but in adeptly managing his expectations, cultivating his trust, and strategically leveraging the alliance to solidify her internal rule. Her most significant challenge may have arisen not from the Hittites, but from within her own kingdom. Local elites, merchants, and religious figures, accustomed to years of Egyptian patronage, may have resented the new Hittite customs and oversight. Tati had to act as a crucial buffer, appeasing her powerful overlord while simultaneously quelling discontent at home. That required diplomacy of the highest order, combined with a sharp understanding of individual personalities, political currents, and shifting loyalties. And crucially, the Hittite king continued to trust her court enough to ensure its loyalty. That speaks volumes about her capabilities. In an era where failed vassals were swiftly replaced or utterly destroyed, Tati and Amurru remained intact. Her leadership was unwavering, and her presence in the diplomatic record continued. This was not the boundless freedom of a sovereign queen. It was something far more precarious, the role of a vital intermediary between a dominant empire and her own people, balancing survival with a degree of autonomy. And few individuals played that role more effectively. Tati lived under Suppiluliuma's formidable shadow, but she was never truly eclipsed by it. She understood how to bend without ultimately breaking, and in the harsh realities of Bronze Age politics, that achievement alone was a triumph. Queen Tati's continued presence in the historical record is exceedingly rare, almost miraculous. The Bronze Age was not known for meticulously preserving the names of women, let alone documenting their accomplishments. Yet Tati's name endures, inscribed in Hittite diplomatic texts, not as a mere wife, not as a shadow behind a king, but as an active participant in statecraft. Her legacy, though faint, shines brilliantly in contrast to the pervasive silence surrounding so many other women of her era. The late Bronze Age was certainly populated by royal women whose influence was quietly immense. Queens of Egypt like Tai and Nefertiti, or Hittite royal women like Pujahipa, who would later, decades on, become a formidable co-ruler. However, most of these influential women either originated from powerful dynasties or were married to dominant kings. Tati, by contrast, came from or operated within a regional buffer state, perpetually caught between the forces of conquest and imminent collapse. That particular circumstance makes her documented presence in foreign archives even more remarkable. We possess no grand monuments or statues of Tati, no gold death mask, no temple with her face carved in stone. Her kingdom was not one characterized by monumental architecture, but rather by its strategic diplomatic survival, held together through complex treaties, advantageous marriages, and necessary compromise. Her legacy is not etched in enduring marble but meticulously written into baked clay tablets, fragile, easily lost, yet somehow still subtly whispering her name through the vast expanse of time. She stands as a singular and rare example of a Bronze Age woman who genuinely held power during a period of immense geopolitical transformation. Tati may have served as a queen regent, a ruling consort, or the widow of a king, but regardless of her specific title, she wielded undeniable, actual influence. She navigated complex wars between powerful superpowers, endured betrayal from former allies, and skillfully handled the constantly shifting sands of Near Eastern politics without ever losing her firm grip on power. And, even more significantly, her story directly challenges the common assumption that ancient women were always passive figures existing solely behind male rulers. Tati was neither passive nor forgotten. She was explicitly named, recorded, and remembered, even if only briefly, by scribes who typically wrote solely about kings. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that history is often unjust in its remembrance, but it is not always entirely blind. Some voices, even faint ones meticulously inscribed in clay, can still resonate powerfully through the ages. In the often impersonal bureaucratic silence of ancient empires, Queen Tati's name echoes with a quiet, yet formidable strength. By aligning Amurru with the Hittite Empire, Queen Tati undeniably secured her kingdom's continued existence, though this came at a significant cost. The alliance brought not only a measure of much-needed protection but also a new, unavoidable layer of oversight. And at the heart of that diligent oversight was Suppiluliuma I, the towering Hittite king who meticulously reshaped the Near East with his unwavering resolve and brilliant strategic prowess. For Tati, expertly navigating her kingdom's newly defined place under his vigilant eye meant treading a precarious, razor-thin line between genuine partnership and effective subjugation. Suppiluliuma was far from a passive overlord. His stringent control of client states such as Amurru was absolute in all but official designation. He routinely dispatched envoys, demanded regular tribute, and expected unyielding compliance from his new vassals. Tati and her court were explicitly expected to adhere to the precise terms of their treaty, offering necessary military support, rigorously securing critical trade routes, and allowing Hittite influence to permeate throughout their entire administration. It's highly probable that Tati had to frequently host Hittite advisors directly at her court, and perhaps even tolerate the presence of Hittite troops stationed nearby within her borders. Her decisions, both those concerning foreign policy and her domestic affairs, were consequently no longer entirely her own to make freely. However, it is vital to remember that she was not powerless. Tati's true skill lay not in directly defying Suppiluliuma's authority, but rather in adeptly managing his considerable expectations, diligently earning his trust, and shrewdly leveraging the alliance to decisively solidify her internal rule. Her most profound and enduring challenge may have originated not from the imposing Hittites themselves, but from within her very own kingdom. Local elites, influential merchants, and powerful religious figures, long accustomed to years of Egyptian patronage, may have deeply chafed under the imposition of new Hittite customs and their increased oversight. Tati had to serve as a crucial buffer, simultaneously appeasing her powerful foreign overlord while also effectively quelling any internal discontent at home. That demanding role required diplomacy of the very highest order, not to mention an acutely keen understanding of individual personalities, complex political currents, and constantly shifting loyalties within her court. And despite these challenges, the Hittite king consistently continued to trust her court sufficiently to enforce its loyalty. That fact, in itself, speaks volumes about her exceptional capabilities and political acumen. In an era where failed vassals were swiftly replaced or utterly destroyed, Tati and her kingdom of Amurru remarkably remained intact. Her leadership was consistently steady, and her significant presence in the invaluable diplomatic record continued without interruption. This was certainly not the unfettered freedom of a truly sovereign queen. It was something far more precarious and complex. The essential role of a crucial broker operating between an immense empire and her own indigenous people, perpetually balancing their survival with a tenuous degree of autonomy. And undeniably, very few individuals played that immensely demanding role better than Queen Tati. Tati lived metaphorically within Suppiluliuma's formidable shadow, but she was never truly eclipsed by it. She possessed an inherent understanding of how to skillfully bend without ultimately breaking, and in the brutal, unforgiving calculus of Bronze Age politics, that singular achievement in itself constituted a profound triumph. Queen Tati's survival within the existing historical record is remarkably rare, almost bordering on the miraculous. The Bronze Age, as a historical period, was certainly not renowned for meticulously preserving the names of women, much less documenting their individual accomplishments in detail. Yet, Tadi's name endures, carefully inscribed within Hittite diplomatic texts, not merely as a king's wife, nor as an obscure shadow behind a male ruler, but as an active and recognized participant in fundamental statecraft. Her legacy, though perhaps faint in its surviving fragments, shines brilliantly and unequivocally in stark contrast to the pervasive silence that surrounds the vast majority of other women from her tumultuous time. The late Bronze Age was indeed filled with numerous royal women whose profound influence was quietly immense. Powerful queens of Egypt such as Tai and Nefertiti, or influential Hittite royal women like Pujahipa, who would rise decades later to become a formidable co-ruler in her own right. However, the majority of these highly influential women either originated from established, powerful dynasties or were married to exceedingly dominant kings of their era. Tadi, by sharp contrast, came from, or consistently operated within the challenging confines of a regional buffer state, a kingdom perpetually caught between the relentless forces of conquest and the constant threat of imminent collapse. That unique and precarious circumstance makes her documented presence within foreign archives even more remarkably significant and unusual. We possess no grand monuments or impressive statues dedicated to Tadi. There is no golden death mask, no grand temple with her face meticulously carved in stone for posterity. Her kingdom was not one famously characterized by monumental architecture, but rather by its astute diplomatic survival, skillfully held together through a delicate web of strategic treaties, carefully arranged marriages, and often painful but necessary compromise. Her enduring legacy is inscribed not in solid, permanent marble but meticulously written into baked clay tablets, materials that are inherently fragile, easily lost to time, yet somehow still subtly whispering her name through the vast, silent expanse of history. She unequivocally stands as a truly rare and exceptional example of a Bronze Age woman who genuinely held significant power and wielded actual influence during a period of immense, tumultuous geopolitical change. Tadi may have served in various capacities, perhaps as a queen regent during a young king's minority, a ruling consort alongside a reigning monarch, or even as the widow of a king exercising sole authority. But whatever her specific title, she undeniably wielded tangible, actual influence. She skillfully navigated complex wars between colossal superpowers, endured the bitter betrayal from former allies, and masterfully handled the constantly shifting sands of Near Eastern politics, all without ever losing her firm and steady grip on power. And even more importantly, her remarkable story directly challenges the long-held notion that ancient women were always passive figures existing merely in the background behind male rulers. Tadi was neither passive nor destined to be forgotten. She was explicitly named, diligently recorded, and demonstrably remembered, however briefly, by the very scribes who typically wrote exclusively about the deeds of kings. Her compelling story serves as a powerful reminder that history is often inherently unfair in its memory, but it is demonstrably not always entirely blind. Some voices, even faint ones meticulously written in ancient clay, can still powerfully echo through the ages. In the often impersonal bureaucratic silence of ancient empires, Queen Tadi's name echoes with a quiet, yet formidable strength. Queen Tadi's final years are largely cloaked in silence. The written records that once mention her abruptly cease, and the very clay tablets that had previously preserved her name give way to more ominous and unsettling signs. Clear indicators of a world beginning its slow, inexorable unraveling. The late Bronze Age was unmistakably drawing to its close, and with it, the intricate, delicate network of diplomacy, widespread trade, and complex royal alliances that had successfully held the entire region together for many centuries. We lack precise knowledge of how or when Tadi passed away. There is no explicit mention of her burial, nor any inscription proudly boasting of her significant accomplishments. However, we do know with certainty that Amuru, much like countless other city-states and kingdoms of that turbulent era, was imminently about to be swept into the overwhelming chaos of what modern historians now refer to as the Bronze Age collapse. A mysterious, decades-long period characterized by widespread destruction, drastic depopulation, and profound cultural fragmentation across the Near East. Between approximately 1200 and 1150 BCE, the great, once mighty powers of the ancient world dramatically fell like interconnected dominoes. The formidable Hittite Empire crumbled entirely, the grand Mycenaean palaces in Greece were suddenly abandoned, and numerous cities burned from Anatolia all the way to Canaan. The precise cause remains hotly debated among scholars. Was it extensive warfare, devastating famine, prolonged drought, catastrophic earthquakes, internal revolt, or the sudden, mysterious appearance of the enigmatic sea peoples? Most likely, it was a confluence of all these factors at once. A perfect, catastrophic storm of disaster. Amurru, tragically caught between the dying Hittites and a briefly resurgent Egypt under the reign of Ramses III, would certainly not escape unscathed from this widespread devastation. Its previously strategic location, once a distinct blessing, now transformed into an unavoidable curse. Armies relentlessly passed through its lands, crucial supply lines completely dried up, and once strong alliances disintegrated into thin air. The intricate political chessboard upon which Tati had once moved so carefully was violently upended. The entire board was flipped, and all the pieces were scattered indiscriminately. And yet, the very fact that we know her name at all is truly extraordinary. Tati may have vanished from history's central stage, but she undeniably lived and quite possibly ruled through one of the most perilous and pivotal periods in all of ancient history. Her decisions, her carefully forged alliances, and her astute survival strategy left lasting ripples that were felt long after she disappeared from the formal record. In the final analysis, Queen Tati was not a figure known for a glorious conquest or the founding of a sweeping dynasty. She was something far rarer and perhaps more profound, a political survivor in a rapidly collapsing world. And although her tangible legacy lies buried beneath countless ruins and has faded into crumbling clay, her name remarkably remains defiant, dignified, and utterly unforgettable. A queen without a tombstone, but certainly not without a lasting memory. Long before the drills and dynamite dramatically reshaped its peak, the mountain now known as Mount Rushmore stood in quiet, untouched majesty, free from the marks of chisels or the faces of presidents. To most Americans in the early 20th century, it was simply another granite peak within the rugged Black Hills of South Dakota. But to the Lakota Sioux people, it was profoundly sacred. They called it Paha Sapa, which translates to the heart of everything that is, a deep spiritual center, not merely a stage for human intervention. The Black Hills had been officially granted to the Lakota in the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, a solemn legal promise that the land would remain theirs forever. But forever proved to be a tragically brief period. After gold was discovered in the region just a few years later, prospectors rapidly flooded in, and the U.S. government quickly reneged on the treaty. The sacred hills were then seized, and the Lakota were forcibly displaced, their spiritual spaces sold, mined, and eventually dynamited. By the 1920s, the United States was deeply yearning for a national myth. The profound trauma of World War I had passed, but a new kind of identity crisis had emerged, one defined by the rapid shifts of modernity, swift industrial change, and an eager search for a unifying national narrative. Against that complex backdrop, a South Dakota historian named Doane Robinson conceived a bold idea: carve gigantic figures of American heroes into a mountainside to attract much-needed tourism and to celebrate the country's perceived greatness. Robinson initially envisioned Western figures like Lewis and Clark, Red Cloud, and Buffalo Bill. But once Gutzon Borglum, a fiercely ambitious sculptor with a deep love for grandeur and fervent nationalism, joined the ambitious project, its scope dramatically shifted. Borglum proposed something far more dramatic: the colossal faces of 4 U.S. presidents, carved at monumental scale directly into the granite cliffs. The specific mountain chosen for the project was not accidental. It offered solid, high-quality granite, excellent visibility from afar, and favorable sun exposure. But it also stood on land that had been unlawfully taken from indigenous people, a fact that was either deliberately ignored or dismissed by the project's enthusiastic boosters at the time. The mountain itself didn't even bear its now famous name in Lakota tradition. Mount Rushmore was a colonial label coined after a visiting New York lawyer in 1885. The land, once alive with tribal stories and ancient rhythms, was about to be transformed into something entirely different: a grand monument to empire, national ambition, and the prevailing American mythos. The face of the mountain was initially blank, but it was far from empty. The individual who would bestow Mount Rushmore with its colossal faces was no ordinary artist. Gutzon Borglum was as much a flamboyant showman as he was a gifted sculptor, a man utterly consumed by obsessions with legacy, fervent nationalism, and grand monumentality. When he arrived in South Dakota in the mid-1920s, he wasn't merely looking to sculpt a mountain. He was fiercely determined to carve his own name indelibly into history. Born in 1867 to Danish immigrants in Idaho, Borglum had studied art in Paris and was profoundly influenced by classical sculpture and the Romantic nationalism prevalent in 19th-century Europe. He admired immense size, powerful symbolism, and the profound idea that art should inspire a deep sense of civic pride. His work had already been displayed in prominent public spaces across the United States, and he had garnered a strong reputation for executing bold, large-scale projects. However, it was his brief, controversial involvement with the Confederate Memorial at Stone Mountain in Georgia that largely defined much of his early fame and notoriety. That particular project ultimately unraveled amidst persistent funding issues and significant creative disagreements. Borglum left the South in a storm of accusations and broken contracts, but he carried with him something immensely valuable: extensive experience with carving granite, handling explosives, and understanding the sheer mechanics required for mountain sculpting. When South Dakota's Don Robinson extended his invitation with the idea of boosting tourism through monumental sculpture, Borglum immediately recognized an opportunity to start anew, on a larger scale, and this time under his complete artistic control. But Borglum had no desire to carve mere regional heroes. He envisioned something far grander: a sacred shrine to American democracy featuring presidents who, in his perspective, had decisively shaped the nation's destiny. He meticulously chose George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt, each, in his view, representing a distinct pillar of the burgeoning republic. Its founding, its territorial expansion, its preservation during civil strife, and its modern development. Borglum's direct involvement swiftly transformed Mount Rushmore from a state-level tourism gimmick into a significant federal monument project. He possessed powerful connections. Even President Calvin Coolidge personally gave his blessing to the endeavor. And Borglum knew precisely how to secure crucial funding, attract widespread media attention, and effectively pitch his patriotic symbolism to the public. For Borglum, art was inherently a tool of myth-making. However, his vision was also deeply controversial. He held strong nationalist beliefs, and his past flirtations with white supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan during the Stone Mountain Project have cast a long and troubling shadow over his overall legacy. Still, his artistic skill was undeniable, and when he gazed upon the Black Hills, he didn't see inert rock. He saw immortality patiently waiting to be carved into existence. Mount Rushmore was never simply sculpted with hammers and chisels alone. It was explosively blasted, meticulously drilled, and relentlessly jackhammered into existence through a blend of precision and controlled violence. A carefully orchestrated chaos managed by Gutzon Borglum and a dedicated crew of over 400 men. From 1927 to 1941, the mountain consistently echoed with daily explosions as the unyielding granite gradually gave way to Borglum's ambitious vision. Work commenced with George Washington's face, chosen for both its profound symbolism and practical considerations. Washington's likeness, standing over 60 feet tall, would serve as the essential template for the subsequent carvings. But carving a mountain is fundamentally different from shaping a block of marble. Granite is notoriously hard, unforgiving, and highly prone to unexpected fractures. To successfully execute the project, Borglum and his team relied on an unusual combination of artistic sensibility and innovative engineering. The process invariably began with dynamite. Blasting crews utilized carefully calculated charges to remove immense quantities of rock, shaving away the mountain's colossal bulk in controlled layers. After the initial blasts, skilled drillers and pointmen would ascend precarious scaffolding hundreds of feet above the ground to meticulously refine the shapes using powerful jackhammers and specialized hand tools. Men literally dangled from ropes, carving distinct eyebrows and prominent noses directly from the sheer rock cliffs. It was highly skilled labor, incredibly dangerous, and often deafeningly loud, yet also strangely intimate in its painstaking detail. Each presidential face required years to complete, and crucially, mistakes simply could not be undone. Despite the monumental scale, the tools employed were surprisingly ordinary. Workers utilized basic equipment powered by air compressors and sheer human ingenuity. Safety was a constant concern, but remarkably, no one was killed during the entire 14 years of construction, a fact Borglum proudly emphasized. Many of the workers were experienced miners, skilled stone cutters, or unemployed laborers from the desperate era of the Great Depression. For them, it was a vital job, a steady paycheck, and an unexpected opportunity to contribute to a piece of history. Progress was inherently slow, and consistent funding proved to be an ongoing challenge. The Great Depression struck just as the project gained momentum, causing crucial funding to dry up across the entire country. Infrastructure projects collapsed, banks failed, and bread lines became a common sight. Yet, Mount Rushmore somehow continued its construction. Why? Because Borglum intimately understood the profound power of spectacle and the intricate politics of national pride. He presented the monument as far more than just a tribute to past presidents. He passionately sold it as a sacred shrine to democracy, a powerful symbol of hope in a time of profound despair. He relentlessly lobbied Congress, carefully courted presidents, and eagerly spoke to anyone who would listen to his vision. Borglum was not merely an artist. He was a master propagandist, and Mount Rushmore served as his grand stage. In the 1930s, the federal government under President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the transformative New Deal programs began channeling substantial money into public works projects. Borglum skillfully secured federal funds through the National Park Service, which elevated the monument from a regional curiosity to a significant national project. The monumental idea of carving American greatness into a mountain suddenly became an essential economic lifeline, creating much-needed jobs, boosting local tourism, and stirring deep patriotic sentiment across the nation. However, the fundraising process was never smooth. Borglum constantly clashed with oversight boards, steadfastly resisted any creative compromises, and adamantly demanded complete artistic control. He frequently exaggerated progress to secure additional funding and even attempted to expand the project far beyond the original 4 faces, proposing full torsos, an elaborate entablature, and even a grand hall of records hidden behind the presidential heads. These ambitious additions were, however, never completed. Public support remained mixed. Many citizens felt a deep sense of pride, seeing the project as concrete proof that America could endure and build even in exceptionally hard times. But critics viewed it as a wasteful extravagance, especially during a period when many people were starving. Others questioned the underlying political motives behind choosing these specific presidents, all white, all male, and all emblematic of expansionist policies that negatively impacted indigenous populations. Still, the crucial money continued to flow. The grand dream, though undeniably expensive and inherently flawed, relentlessly marched onward. For Borglum, every dollar raised represented a vote of faith, not only in his monument but in the profound American myth it was explicitly designed to immortalize. By the late 1930s, Mount Rushmore was clearly taking shape. 3 presidents were complete, a 4th was underway, and the intricate scaffolding still towered high. But then, in March of 1941, the monument's visionary creator, Gutzon Borglum, suddenly died from complications following surgery. He was 73 years old. The man who had dreamed, passionately fought for, and explosively carved this monumental vision into stone was gone, and the entire project was left abruptly without its driving force. Borglum's death sent a wave of profound uncertainty throughout the project. He hadn't simply been the sculptor. He had been the primary architect, the relentless fundraiser, the public face, and the unifying visionary who held it all together. Without him, there was no one possessing the same unique combination of artistic clarity and political acumen. There were blueprints, yes. There were plaster models, but the dynamic energy was unmistakably absent. His son, Lincoln Borglum, a quieter, dedicated man who had worked closely under his father's supervision for years, took over the project. He was capable and committed, but far less grandiose in his ambitions. While Gutzon had dreamed of full torsos, elaborate inscriptions, and intricate finishing details, Lincoln adopted a far more practical approach. With time rapidly running out and crucial funding severely constrained, He focused solely on completing Roosevelt's face and ensuring the structural integrity of the site. Then came another significant blow, World War II. As America turned its urgent attention overseas, national priorities decisively shifted. Federal funding was swiftly reallocated to the war effort, and national sentiment moved rapidly from monumental projects to wartime mobilization. Suddenly, there were far more pressing things to construct than colossal statues. By October 31st, 1941, the work on Mount Rushmore officially ceased. The carvings were left in their existing state, incomplete according to Borglum's original, expansive design, but still undeniably monumental. The planned Hall of Records, intended to house important American documents and ideals, remained a hidden, unfinished, and unused chamber behind Lincoln's head. Only decades later would a sealed repository of historical documents finally be placed there. And yet, even in its incomplete state, Mount Rushmore stood as a perfectly realized idea. For presidential faces gazing out over the Black Hills, not precisely what Borglum had envisioned, but powerful enough to become an enduring national icon. Borglum's death changed the very mountain itself. It froze his ambitious dream in place. The monument, once vibrantly alive with artistic ambition, became solid, static, and profoundly silent, much like the very stone it was carved from. Today, Mount Rushmore stands as one of the most widely recognizable landmarks in the United States. A towering symbol of national pride, a significant tourist attraction, and a site layered with profound political complexity. To some, it is a breathtaking celebration of core American ideals. To others, it serves as a painful reminder of the human cost of empire. Its meaning subtly shifts depending on who you ask. More than 2 million people visit the site annually, gazing up at the 60-foot faces of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. They come for photographs, for a sense of patriotism, and for the sheer awe inspired by the engineering feat. But beneath the surface, the legacy of Mount Rushmore is far from straightforward. The monument has become a focal point in ongoing conversations about history, race, indigenous land rights, and national identity. Critics argue that it glorifies presidents who directly oversaw the expansion of the United States at the explicit expense of Native American nations. Carving their faces into Lakota sacred land that was seized in direct violation of federal treaties, is viewed by many as a lasting injustice. For the Lakota people, Mount Rushmore is not a monument to liberty. It is a profound scar. At the same time, the monument has been fiercely defended by those who perceive it as a testament to American perseverance, a product of ingenuity and grit forged during the challenging Great Depression era, and a fitting tribute to strong national leadership. It has appeared extensively in films, advertisements, textbooks, and political rallies, often serving as a shorthand for America itself. Even presidents have offered their opinions. Ronald Reagan famously called it a monument to American exceptionalism. Barack Obama visited the site and acknowledged its undeniable beauty, while also noting its inherent contradictions. Activists have protested there, and tourists have even proposed marriage there. It is a place of complex pilgrimage, simultaneously sacred and deeply contested. Meanwhile, the unfinished Hall of Records, discreetly tucked behind Lincoln's head, now houses copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and a brief biography of Gutzon Borglum. These documents rest within a titanium vault, sealed inside a mountain intended for future civilizations to one day discover. In the end, Mount Rushmore is not simply a sculpture. It is a complex story carved into granite, subsequently edited by history, and continuously debated with every passing generation. A powerful national myth, towering and perpetually incomplete, much like the very country it was designed to represent. When we imagine ancient Egypt, we typically picture majestic pyramids, golden death masks, and gods with animal heads. But if you look closer, you'll notice something else. Everyone is impeccably dressed in linen. Not silk, not wool, linen. And not just any linen. It was smooth, bleached, and immaculately pleated. Egypt's hot, dry climate made linen the perfect fabric. It was light, breathable, and could be worn in layers without trapping too much heat. Made from the flax plant, producing linen required significant effort. First, the flax was harvested, soaked, and repeatedly beaten, then spun into fine threads, and finally woven into fabric. This was not casual wear. Linen was labor-intensive and therefore highly valuable. Pharaohs wore it, priests wore it, and even the deceased were dressed in it, mummified in layer after layer of meticulously prepared linen wrappings. Egyptians believed clothing held importance not just in life, but also in death. Your attire helped secure your identity in the afterlife. A well-wrapped mummy wasn't just fashionable. It was spiritually fortified. Social status was quite literally woven into what you wore. The elite flaunted semi-transparent linen tunics, often pleated or dyed pure white, a color associated with purity and divine power. Ordinary workers wore simpler kilts, sometimes little more than a wrapped cloth tied with a belt. But even they appreciated linen's cool elegance. Children often wore nothing until puberty, but even their first garment marked a significant rite of passage. Jewelry, of course, completed the ensemble. Wide collars made of faience and gold, lapis lazuli amulets, and beaded sandals. A nobleman's wardrobe might include elaborate wigs, kohl-lined eyes, and perfumed cones that slowly melted over the head at lavish banquets. Fashion in Egypt wasn't superficial. It was intertwined with ritual, identity, and social rank. Priests, who needed to maintain ritual cleanliness, wore only the finest white linen and strictly avoided anything of animal origin. No wool, no leather. Clothing was not just fabric. It was a form of spiritual armor, separating the sacred from the profane. Even slaves and servants had specific clothing suited to their tasks, though rarely with adornment. Yet whether they worked in the fields or attended the palace, linen defined Egyptian fashion for thousands of years. So while other civilizations were still bundling themselves in animal skins and wool, Egypt was pioneering one of humanity's first fabric revolutions. Smooth, sunlit, and stitched into eternity. If Egypt spun gold from flax, Mesopotamia meticulously wove its civilization in wool. In the fertile lands nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the earliest city-states were also among the earliest trendsetters. Their signature fashion involved draped robes, wide belts, and multiple layers of wool, the textile pride of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria. Here, wool was more than just clothing. It was the backbone of their economy. Sheep were ubiquitous, and their fleece was crucial for Mesopotamian trade, temple offerings, and taxation. In fact, temple complexes managed vast flocks and textile production like miniature empires. Clothing was centralized, sacred, and bureaucratic all at once. The typical attire for men was the konakes, a wraparound skirt or tunic often made from tufted wool, giving it a shaggy, pelt-like appearance. At first glance, it might seem as if someone simply skinned a sheep and wore it untrimmed. That isn't far from the truth in its initial form, but over time it became a stylized ceremonial garment, even a royal one. Kings, priests, and deities were frequently depicted wearing konakes robes, signifying its prestige. Women's garments were similarly draped, but sometimes extended to the ankles with one shoulder exposed, practical yet refined. These outfits were not sewn or tailored with the precision of Egyptian linen. Instead, they were draped and pinned, shaped more by artistic arrangement than by stitching. Social class dictated the finer details. Elites wore fine, dyed wool, rich indigos, deep reds, sometimes adorned with fringe or intricate embroidery. Servants and laborers wore coarser versions, and like in Egypt, children often went nude until a certain age. Modesty, after all, was a flexible concept in early civilizations. Mesopotamians also favored wide belts or girdles, often crafted from leather or wool cords, to secure their garments. These belts were status symbols, sometimes embellished with bronze studs or inscribed with names, prayers, or symbols of divine protection. Headwear was common, especially among men. Conical hats, headbands, and turbans indicated identity and status. Soldiers and messengers might wear simple leather caps, while priests and royalty sported more elaborate coverings. Jewelry completed the look. Earrings, bracelets, and necklaces made of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and carnelian Even the poorest often wore at least a simple bead or amulet for protection. So while Egypt flowed with linen, Mesopotamia confidently wore wool, raw, warm, and laden with meaning. Their draped style wasn't just about fabric. It was about power, piety, and the world's very first carefully curated wardrobes. While Egypt mastered linen and Mesopotamia flaunted wool, the people of the Indus Valley quietly revolutionized clothing with something soft, breathable, and remarkably advanced for its time: cotton. Yes, actual spun and woven cotton, and they achieved this over 5,000 years ago. Centered around cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, the Indus Valley civilization left behind no grand temples or royal tombs, but it did leave hints of a highly organized, hygienic, and fashion-conscious society. Their clothing was clean, minimal, and functional, perfectly suited to the hot, humid climate of what is now modern-day Pakistan and northwest India. The evidence we have comes from terracotta figurines, seal impressions, and some impressively detailed sculptures. Men typically wore a short kilt or a wrapped cloth tied at the waist, while women draped longer garments, sometimes over one shoulder. Think of it as an early precursor to the sari. Both genders wore minimal but elegant clothing, always designed for ease of movement and to combat the heat. And yes, they were the first civilization known to cultivate cotton. This wasn't merely resourceful. It was revolutionary. Cotton's breathability and softness made it ideal for daily life, especially in contrast to the heavier, animal-based fibers used in other regions. The Indus people spun it, wove it, and likely dyed it using natural pigments, perhaps indigo or turmeric, both of which were readily available in the region. Simplicity did not equate to dullness. Many figurines depict women adorned with elaborate jewelry, bangles extending up the arms, earrings, and beaded necklaces. Hair was often styled or braided, and decorative combs and cosmetic containers have been discovered in excavations, suggesting regular grooming rituals. There's even a famous bronze sculpture known as the Dancing Girl, dating back to around 2500 BCE. She wears nothing but a handful of bangles, yet her pose, confidence, and adornment speak volumes about the cultural comfort with both grace and minimalism. What's striking is how little waste and excess seem to have characterized Indus fashion. There was no obsession with grandiosity, just well-made, locally sourced, climate-appropriate clothing that seamlessly integrated into daily life. No gold-studded robes or thick layers, just the inherent elegance of clean lines and ingenious fabric use. In the quiet streets of Harappa, fashion wasn't ostentatious, but it was light years ahead of its time. By the time the Minoans rose to prominence around 2000 BCE on the island of Crete, fashion had undergone a dramatic transformation from modest functionality to something far more expressive and, frankly, magnificent. The Minoans didn't simply wear clothes to survive the Mediterranean climate. They used clothing to captivate, to facilitate movement, to entice, and perhaps most importantly, to dance. Minoan clothing was light and vibrant, tailored not only for the heat, but for visual impact. Men typically wore loincloths or kilts, sometimes elaborate with patterned sashes, other times bare-chested with tight belts emphasizing the waist. But it was the women's fashion that truly commanded attention. Depictions from Minoan frescoes, such as those at Knossos, showcase women wearing garments unlike anything seen in other ancient cultures. Fitted bodices with flounced, layered skirts, sometimes bell-shaped, often tiered, and remarkably open fronts that left the breasts exposed. No, not by accident. This was a deliberate fashion choice, possibly for ritualistic purposes, possibly indicating status, and certainly intentional. These corset-like tops created an hourglass silhouette for women, cinching the waist while allowing complete freedom of movement. The skirts swayed dramatically with every step, especially during the athletic dances and religious ceremonies for which Minoans were renowned. Clothing here wasn't static, it was dynamic. Every layer, fold, and color contributed to the impression of motion. The fabrics were likely linen or wool, dyed in bright blues, reds, yellows, and purples using plant-based pigments. Decorative borders, intricate embroidery, and perhaps even imported threads added visual appeal. Minoan tailors clearly possessed a keen sense of style. They weren't just cutting cloth, they were sculpting identity. Both men and women adorned themselves with jewelry, necklaces, bracelets, and elaborate earrings often crafted from gold, silver, and semi-precious stones like carnelian and turquoise. Hair was kept long and meticulously styled, sometimes curled or braided with elaborate headdresses or hats for ceremonial occasions. Even children were dressed with care, indicating that clothing played a role not just in function but in the performance of status, age, and role within society. And given the prominence of women in Minoan art, their elaborate clothing may have symbolized more than mere beauty. It may have conveyed authority. The Minoans brought fashion off the loom and onto the stage, transforming every hem into a piece of theater and every outfit into a living sculpture in motion. In ancient China, clothing was never simply fabric. It was interwoven with philosophy, hierarchy, and served as an instrument of imperial control. And at the heart of it all, silk. Glorious, shimmering silk, so highly prized that people once believed it was spun directly from the gods. In truth, it originated from the unassuming silkworm, but the impact of its discovery would ripple across continents and centuries. The origins of silk production date back to the Neolithic period, with the earliest confirmed evidence from around 2700 BCE. According to legend, Empress Lezu was the first to unravel a cocoon that had accidentally fallen into her tea, thus discovering the delicate filament within. Whether factual or not, silk production quickly became one of China's most closely guarded secrets, revealing how to make it was punishable by death. By the Shang and Zhou dynasties, silk had already become the defining characteristic of Chinese sophistication. Unlike rough wool or stiff linen, silk flowed gracefully, light, cool, and luminous. It was perfectly suited for China's varied climates, and it absorbed dyes beautifully. Imperial yellows, deep reds, and bold blues were woven into intricate patterns. Dragons for emperors, clouds for scholars, and waves for courtiers. Clothing became explicitly codified by class. The more silk you wore, the higher your social rank. The cut, color, and even sleeve length could signal everything from your social standing to your specific occupation. Commoners were forbidden from wearing certain colors or weaves, while members of the nobility glided through palaces in robes that practically whispered power with every step. The Han Dynasty, 206 BC, 220 CE, elevated silk to a diplomatic weapon. Bolts of silk were traded with nomadic tribes, offered as tribute, and eventually sent westward along the Silk Road, giving the route its enduring name. Chinese clothing, especially among elites, now featured wide-sleeved robes, sashes, and multiple layers. The way a robe folded, with the left side overlapping the right, became a matter of profound cultural identity. Women's fashion included high-waisted skirts, long flowing sleeves, and elaborate hairpins. Men's garments emphasized grace and humility, aligning with Confucian ideals. Clothing was expected to reflect inner virtue and cosmic balance. Silk wasn't just a luxury. It was a silent yet absolute language. In ancient China, what you wore wasn't just about your appearance. It signified who you were, how you thought, and where you belonged. In ancient Greece, fashion didn't demand attention loudly. It flowed, rapped, and whispered elegance. The Greeks weren't preoccupied with tailoring or intricate stitching. Their approach to clothing was architectural, even sculptural. With a single length of cloth, they created garments that expressed movement, intellect, and grace. No scissors, no seams, just geometry, skillful drapery, and a deep respect for natural form. The fundamental Greek garment was the chiton, a rectangular piece of linen or wool, folded and pinned at the shoulders with brooches or fibulae, then belted at the waist. Depending on the material and how it was draped, the chiton could be light and airy for daily wear or formal and layered for special occasions. Men wore it knee-length, women ankle-length. It was a versatile canvas of identity, adaptable to age, gender, and specific events. Over this, citizens might wear a himation, a heavier cloak wrapped over one shoulder, useful for warmth, modesty, or dramatic effect, depending on how it was styled. Think of it as a wearable toga, a symbol of dignity and contemplation, often associated with philosophers, statesmen, and elders. The Greeks believed that clothing should mirror inner virtue. Simplicity was celebrated, while extravagance was generally frowned upon, especially in Athens where public modesty was considered a civic virtue. Spartan men were even more rigorous, often going barefoot and cloaked in coarse red wool, emphasizing austerity over appearance. But don't let the apparent simplicity mislead you.